Hey everybody, welcome back to Summit. It's the sixth Sunday of Easter. My name is Mark. Let's hop into the readings. Not too long ago, my youngest, he is 8 now, he came into our room middle of the night, very freaked out. And he had a nightmare. And obviously it was a nightmare that really shook him because he didn't just roll over and go back to sleep. I mean, he came in and he was visibly shaken, and all he wanted to do was to know from Dad that it's okay. It's okay. Right? And I was able to kind of wake up enough. I mean, I was half asleep, but wake up enough to be able to console him, walk him back to his room, sit with him, say a prayer over him. It's okay. But this happens to everybody. We all have nightmares. God's got you. And that image, I mean, no matter how old we get, when you go through something traumatic, you go through a really hard time, you go through something that's just really weighing on you, and it might shake you or rock you a little bit. We all still desire that knowledge. We desire that assurance that it's okay, that somebody's got us, right? That somebody's there to look us in the eyes and say, I got you. I got you. It's okay. And that's really what's happening in this gospel this week for this sixth Sunday of Easter. Now, it's really important when you hear a gospel, if we've heard the story before, if you haven't heard it before, to understand where in the narrative, where in the gospel narrative, where in the life of Jesus story's taking place. And when you look, this comes from John chapter 14. Now that might not sound like it means anything to you just at first glance. Oh, John chapter 14, whatever. How many chapters are in John? 21, by the way. But it's John chapter 14. Okay, so chapter 14 is already in the context of the Last Supper, right? So chapter 13, for instance, is the washing of the feet. So we know the feet have already been washed. We're into the Eucharistic meal, the Last Supper. This is where he's going to be betrayed and denied. And when you start to read in 14 and 15 and 16, before you get to the Passion part, there's a lot of teaching that Jesus gives that St. John puts right in this time period. And this is a really important reminder. When you hear him, don't let your hearts be troubled, okay? I'm with you. God's with you. Don't let your hearts be troubled or afraid, he says. Now, again, when he's saying this to the apostles, the crucifixion hasn't happened yet. They're on their way there. Jesus knows it, but the apostles aren't necessarily sure how this is all going to pan out. They don't know it. So he's telling them ahead of time, actually, when things are still okay, so, don't let your hearts be troubled or afraid. And you know what? If God came to you on the good days, it says, don't let your hearts be troubled or afraid. It's easier to believe. And he tells us this on the good days, so when the bad days come, or the nightmares come, or the hard times come, that we can go back and remember. Go back and remember what he said. Go back and remember what he assured us, what he promised us. Because hard times are going to come. This week's first reading, yet again, we're going to hear about Paul and Barnabas, and there's a lot of infighting and bickering, and people are having disagreements and hard discussions. This is because this is the early church, okay? This is post-resurrection, Christians coming together, different communities, different churches, trying to figure out how to be a church. And it's messy, and there's arguments, and there's backbiting, and backstabbing, and gossiping. It's like the church today. It still happens, right? In parishes, it still happens in dioceses, it still happens in the church. There's arguments and disagreements, and this is what happens because we're all sinners, and it's going to be tricky, and we have to remember, don't let your hearts be troubled or afraid. Deal with the hard stuff, face the hard stuff, but remember at the end of the day, like a good son or daughter, God's got this. He's got this, and it's okay. That's why in the vision from the second reading in Revelation, we were reminded of the authority of who's in heaven and the angels and the saints, and we're given this vision, right? And there's literally it's pointing in all directions. Saints, and angels, pointed in all directions, north, south, east, west. Remind us that we're called to unity, yes, but that unity is underneath God's authority. So we're all called to find a way to get along. We're sisters and brothers, right? What happens with sisters and brothers? Well, you don't always like each other, but you are called to love each other. That's what happens in our house, right? You're still called to love each other. So we're called to unity that exists under God's authority. And those two are really important. And that's where you see the cross. See, the cross is our link between heaven and earth, but also our link between one another. So you have your vertical, but you also have your horizontal. We have to learn how to love one another and how to function as one family under the Father. Who's got this? So even if your day is hard, even if there's backbiting and annoyance, okay, even frustration, or if your day's filled with fear of the unknown, or temptation, or threats, or darkness, or those sorts of things that come with nightmares, whether you're asleep or you're awake, you might be living in a nightmare right now, I don't even know. At the end of the day, realize that whether or not your earthly father's here, that you always have your Heavenly Father, and you can go to Him and you can tell Him what's going on. And He's going to look back at you and say, my son or my daughter, do not let your heart be troubled or afraid. I'm your Father, and I've got this, and we'll get through it together.